Need for Speed Most Wanted in 2005 was something truly special. It had reached the highest peak of the arcade racing mountain and would go into the Hall of Greats within the history of racing gaming. Its legacy still lives on within the community, and content creators are playing the game with mods, or doing challenge runs, speed runs, or just simply analysing and picking apart one of the best games ever made. The demand for a successor was incredibly high. EA had wanted another sequel as soon as possible. This had put Black Box in crunch time, and a lot sooner than we had expected, we were shown a new Need for Speed game, which would be titled Carbon for some reason. Nevertheless, the hype was there, and the footage we were shown gave us a mix of Underground and Most Wanted vibes. On the 30th of October 2006, Need for Speed Carbon would be released among the masses. Given its relatively quick release, with Most Wanted only being out for a year, Carbon was in every way a similar product, while still being different in its own way. Its reception was positive, but not quite as much compared to Most Wanted due to legit criticisms that would be shared not only by reviewed sites, but also fans of the Need for Speed games. But the game was still enjoyed by the majority of the community, for that it was similar to Most Wanted in the sense that it shared the same driving model and would update the car roster by a large margin. It goes right back to the nighttime setting that the Underground games had, and it would introduce some new features to make the experience fresh once again. As for how the game measures as of today, and compared to Most Wanted, let's find out. Also, there will be spoilers, so stop watching now if you haven't played it. Need for Speed Carbon sets itself in Palmont City, a neon-lit, clean city that's not unlike Bayview City from Underground 2. Its story is both a prequel and a sequel at the same time. Let me explain. The initial sequence of events all stem from a big race that we, the player, partake in. Everything seems to be going smoothly more or less until the cops intercept the race. The other 3 drivers get arrested and you somehow manage to escape. You leave town and guess what? You go to Rockport City, making this game a prequel to Most Wanted. But then we're shown the player driving back to Palmont City with the iconic BMW. Not too long after, we get chased by Cross, who makes a return in an effort to pursue the player for basically humiliating him back in Rockport. The theory is that he was either fired or he quit on purpose so he could dedicate his time to hunting you down. Either way, he finally gets his payback and our BMW ends up being a write-off. Truly one of the saddest moments in gaming history. Anyway, another dude arrives in an Audi Le Mans Quattro named Darius, the same person who told you to leave town in the first place. He gets Cross off your tail, and not too long after, another girl arrives named Nikki, who looks pissed to see you. The previous games have had mascot girls, or girls that represent you like Samantha or Rachel or Mia, but Nikki is a more personal character because she is someone who has history with you. Her reaction to you says it all. In any case, Darius decides that you owe him once more, and mentions the crew's getting out of control opting for territory within Palmont City. He enlists you to go against the 3 main crews and bring things under control. He pairs Nikki with you, and from there, you get to pick your first car. And from there, the story gets going. You meet other characters throughout your time in the game, some of them becoming crew members and others being the rival crew bosses themselves, who turn out to be the same people you raced against in the beginning. They're not happy to see you, and it seems that you're the one at fault for the race going to shit. In any case, you go to work chewing at their territory, and you eventually go against the bosses. There are 3 of these guys, and there is a 4th one that you won't find out until later on. The story and the progression, I hate to say, is really short here. Most Wanted took a considerable amount of time considering how many bosses you had to go through in order to get to Razor and to get your car back. In Carbon, there are 4 main bosses, and they can be taken care of in quick succession. And there aren't a lot of races in each piece of territory either. This was one of the most disappointing aspects of the game. To some extent, it even feels like a glorified expansion of Most Wanted. And I think a lot of it is attributed to the fact that Black Box didn't have enough time to flesh the game out more and give it a bigger campaign experience. But while it's short, it's also sweet. You have more cutscenes this time around, and even some in-game scenes where you have the characters actually modeled in their own cars. This was something new for the series at the time, but for something that came out in 2006, it's not too bad. It tells a simpler story without interfering too much with the racing. The crew aspect is something that conceptually is really cool, and gives the setting of Carbon its own identity. Quite literally, since you race other crews all the time in races. The characters themselves don't really have a lot to work with, but they do their part pretty well here. Seeing Cross make a return was great, even though his role wasn't as big this time around. The other characters also stand out pretty well. The villain who, spoiler alert, turns out to be Darius, after committing an anime betrayal against you, is also a pretty well written villain. Just as good as Razor in my opinion. And yes, his race is actually pretty hard. A lot harder than Razor, that's for sure. Story-wise, it's decent, but was way too short for its potential to be realised. The setting, however, is something I really like. Palmont City is, like I said, similar to Bayview City. You have the downtown setting, the industrial section, the cliffside large town, and of course the Vegas-inspired section of Silverton. You have 4 districts to explore and race in. There's downtown, Kempton, Fortuna, and Silverton. They all have their own style and scenery that stand out, and each boss have their own district. You have Kenji's Bushidos in downtown, Angie's 21st Street Crew in Kempton, Wolf's TFK in Fortuna, and finally, Darius's Stacked Deck Crew in Silverton. You can tackle the territories all at once or do them one at a time. As for me, I usually start in downtown, then Kempton, then Fortuna, and depending on what car you select may also affect which territory you tackle first. The setting of Palmont City is a polar opposite of Rockport. Rockport had the more run-down ghetto-esque approach to its boroughs and districts, whereas Palmont feels more well-off, well-maintained, and cleaner in comparison. Its high-tech inspired design correlates really well with the nighttime setting, which adds an underground flavour to the Most Wanted style gameplay, which is another thing to talk about here. Now, if you've just come off of Most Wanted, Need for Speed Carbon is already going to feel pretty familiar already. And that was because Black Box had decided to implement the same model into this game, while adding new features. So in this respect, there's not a lot to say other than the fact that it plays pretty much like Most Wanted. However, it has been customized a little bit. For starters, traffic collisions behave a lot more differently this time. And for the worst, I might add. They have this tendency to go back and reverse in the direction you're going, oftentimes making you crash into them again. In Most Wanted they were a nuisance for sure, but not to this extent. The screen also tends to shake a little bit when you're going at higher speeds. I really don't think this was necessary to give off the feeling that you were going really fast, because Most Wanted already did it fine with the blur effect. So, in terms of the gameplay, it is basically, like I said, Most Wanted at its core, but I'm okay with that considered the fact that Most Wanted's driving model was already amazing, and to apply it in a more underground-inspired setting made me really happy. Now, the biggest addition to the core gameplay are 2 things. 1, the crew member system, that consists of 3 classes. Scouts, who go ahead and look for shortcuts. Drafters, go ahead and get you to stick to them, the result being a boost of speed when you release yourself. And blockers, the most useful class in my opinion. They get onto opponents and cause them to crash, and when they work, they can stop rubber banding opponents giving you a hard time. Oftentimes, I'd either use Neville or Samson for a good portion of the game, and then I just end up with Nikki when she finally joins your team. The crew member system is something that's good on paper, but mediocre in execution. Oftentimes, they just get in your way and hold you back, especially when you have to do speed trap races and they just stop in front of you for no reason. Each crew member also have their own perks and do make the game a bit easier in some ways. And if you're not happy with the way their car looks, you can customize it so that it fits your crew better. Given more development though, the crew system would have been done a lot better and had more substance. Thankfully, the spin-off, Own the City, does a better job at executing the crew mechanic. Then there's the cars themselves. The roster of cars is amazing here. You have not just the career stuff, but also all of the bonus cars that you can unlock in the challenge mode, as well as the reward cards, which you earn by meeting certain milestones, and there's a lot of those. They handle similarly to Most Wanted, but have way more distinctions now. You have tuners, which are dominant in handling, muscle cars for acceleration but with shit handling, and exotics with great top speed but average handling. You get the car based on your preferences. I generally go for tuners because JDMs are my favourite type of cars, with classic muscle cars being a close second like the Dodge Charger or the Plymouth Barracuda. The variety is amazing here. But the biggest grip I have with this game, and its biggest sin, in my opinion, is the tier system. Basically, you have 3 tiers. The higher the tier, the better the car is. No longer can you just use whatever car you want to beat the game. You have to eventually get another car that's a higher tier so you can have a fighting chance in the later races. The first boss has you racing tier 1 cars, then the other 2 are tier 2 cars. Silverton pits you against tier 3 cars, and at that point, the last 2 tier cars become obsolete because they won't perform as well. I don't know why they would do it like this. It severely limits your flexibility to get by with whatever car you liked, and given the fact that if you invest too much into the wrong car, then you're pretty much screwed unless you're willing to redo races for pennies. In a game that is centered around customizing your car's performance, It eventually should get to a point where the distinctions don't matter as much. In Carbon though, the difference is between the tiers, and I hate this system. As for the races, you have Circuit, Sprint, and Speed Trap and Toll Booth, which is called Checkpoint in this game, making a return. But some new modes have been added too. Race Wars is a big circuit race with a shit ton of cars. You unlock them after beating a boss in their own turf. Then you have Drifting, which finally comes back, and how it's implemented here is different from the Underground games. Your sense of speed is much faster. The car locks into a drifting animation like a magnet, and how you accumulate points is also dependent on your speed. I actually quite like it. You can hold drifts a hell of a lot longer here, and when you're doing it down the canyon, it's quite satisfying when you do a perfect run without hitting anything. It does take quite a bit of time to get used to though, but once you nail it, it's a lot of fun. Drag and Lap Knockout don't come back though, and as for Drag, I'm glad it's gone since I've never been a fan of it anyway. Drifting is a much better mode. Anyway, what else is there? Well, there's the Canyon Duels. Basically, you start off in the mountains against your rival. You usually do this against the main bosses once you've beaten them in a circuit race. You start by following them down the path and getting as many points as possible until the finish line. Then you go about it again, but this time you're taking the lead, and you have to reach the finish line without losing all of your points. Also, don't go off the cliff. You automatically lose. Although I haven't figured it out yet, you can actually ram your opponents off the cliff too, which leads to some funny cutscenes showing their demise. Oh, and if you actually take the lead and hold it for 10 seconds, you win the event entirely, but the same goes for them if you lose your position in the second phase. I find this mode pretty fun. It reminds me of the initial D anime where they're going down the mountains, with the high risk of going off the cliff at any moment. It's the only game in the series that implements this race mode, and it's a shame it hasn't returned since. The cops from Most Wanted are also in the game, but don't really matter that much this time around. You can pretty much ignore them for the most part since they're not a part of the game's main story progression whatsoever. However, they do often make an appearance in most of the races. As for how they function, well, it's pretty much the same from before. You have the same use of tactics, heat levels, cooldowns, destructible objects to take down cops, and hiding spots. A lot of the times though, they can be quite annoying. In Most Wanted, you have to deal with them anyway, so you would get used to their quirks. In Carbon, they're like that one person that you didn't invite to your party, but shows up anyway. And besides the reward card milestones, there's no real benefit to getting into cop chases this time around anyway, since there's no requirement in the game's story for you to go on chases with them. You can also do the police pursuits in the challenge mode and attain some rewards, so there's that I guess. Otherwise, it's pretty disappointing that they didn't really do anything more to enhance the already fantastic police pursuit mode from Most Wanted. The car customization has been vastly improved compared to Most Wanted. You have way more customization options now than before, from aftermarket parts to paints that give you a wider range than before, vinyls with the ability to rotate, resize, or skew in an effort to really customize your car, and a lot of unique vinyls to add too. I would even say that it's just as good as Underground 2. However, it sucks that there's no neons. Then there's the auto sculpt mechanic. Basically, it lets you modify your car's body parts to your liking, although it's more of a gimmick since a lot of the auto sculpt parts don't look that good anyway. It was still a pretty unique mechanic for its time though, and for some of the muscle cars, getting that engine out is pretty awesome. The same system would be implemented later in Pro Street, Nitro, and Undercover, but wouldn't make a return afterwards, and that was most likely due to the lack of interest among players. All in all, customization is heaps better in this game than in Most Wanted. The soundtrack here is criminally underrated and sadly unnoticed, and that's because of the brilliant idea to treat it as something to be used while you're free roaming or when you're doing the checkpoint races. What you have instead are these original pieces that play out during canyon duels and races. The music itself is fine, but I hate the fact that you can't just switch between them and the licensed music. I don't know why they'd even bother obtaining all of these licenses if they were going to barely use it. Some people would say to just play the soundtrack over Spotify or something, but that's not the point. The point is choice, and it's something you don't have in this game, other than to just turn it off. Thankfully, the PSP version made sense to actually use the game's fucking soundtrack since it's actually pretty awesome. You have a lot more electronic music this time since it reflects the more neon high-tech setting of Palment, with some rock and hip-hop to go along with it. But like any other licensed soundtrack, it'll vary on your preferences. It's one of my favorite soundtracks in the series. It's just a shame it's so underutilized here. Need for Speed Carbon is both a great game and a disappointing sequel. There was so much potential for this game to be even bigger than it was, but due to the shadow that Most Wanted had cast over it, The game was forced to live up to such a high expectation that it ultimately failed as a sequel that would transcend the series. Need for Speed Carbon with its limited time frame would just end up being Most Wanted set in the nighttime with some new mechanics that weren't quite as well executed as I hoped it would be. And yet, I still love the game nonetheless. I really enjoy the setting, the roster of cars is incredible, the customization is really good, and the new race editions are quite nice, especially with Drift returning and still being fun. For a long time, I had considered Carbon to be the last good Need for Speed game for me. Pro Street was a game that I acknowledged to be a good Need for Speed game too, but I just don't like the game at all. Undercover was just straight up garbage, and afterwards came a bunch of mediocre games, save for Hot Pursuit 2010. But lately the series has made somewhat of a comeback. Need for Speed Heat and Unbound were enjoyable, with flaws of their own. But right now, the series really needs a new driving model, I think. Other than that though, Need for Speed Carbon, for all of its shortcomings and wasted potential, is still a great game in its own right and is still worth playing today. Thank you for watching.